Welcome to game number 7 of the World Chess Championship match. Gukesh with the white pieces plays the move knight f3. In previous rounds, Gukesh played e4 and wasn't able to get a big advantage. When he deviated and played d4, he was successful in winning that third game. Ding plays pawn d5 and Gukesh plays pawn g3. Very slow and simple development, going for some Catalan setup. Black played pawn g6. Ding also avoiding the center at this point and playing a solid but slow setup, and this opening can transpose into many different types of openings. After d4, bishop g7, pawn c4. Gukesh challenges the center on the light squares. Black should have good chances to equalize with the move pawn to c6, going for a variation of the Slav defense. After pawn c6, after bishop g2, Ding played this with the white pieces against Sam Shankland in 2019 and won. But now he has the black pieces, and after the move knight to f6, we're following a game that Ding had played where Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces and Ding had black, getting a draw. So good results for Ding with the white pieces and also with black as well. After castles, Gukesh played a very interesting move here, rook to e1. I haven't seen this move before, but it seems the point is to prepare the move pawn to e4. Not the best move here, according to the engine, but what's interesting about this move is it asks a big question to black, which is, out of prep, what exactly do you play to stop white from playing like knight to c3 and e4? I like these moves at higher and higher levels because it takes the opponent out of preparation and also asks them what setup are they going to play for. If they play for bishop f5, then the bishop might be vulnerable to h3 and g4 later. If the bishop goes to g4, then white has the move knight to e5. If black plays knight e7, then they have still the question of how to develop the light squared bishop. So I was considering black playing a waiting move in return with a move like a6. But then again, a6 may be just wasting time and maybe weakening the b6 square. So I wasn't exactly sure how black should deal with this. Ding captures on c4, and he takes about 30 minutes with this move. White plays e4, which is very consistent with playing rook to e1. Now black has to play quite accurately, otherwise white will be much better with the two pawns in the center. After bishop to g4, white is a pawn down, but with the center, and if white can regain the pawn, for example with knight a3 or knight e2, white will be much better. After the move knight e2, Ding played the move pawn c5, challenging the center rather than holding onto the structure with the move pawn to b5. After this, we can play either the move pawn to a4, trying to chop away at these pawns, or a move like h3, bishop e6, a4, a5, takes, d5, and bishop c8. And white definitely has a lot for the pawn. He has a big center, the two bishops, and great development if this bishop can come to life. So Ding played the move c5, trying to solve the problems of the center immediately. Gukesh played pawn d5, and Ding again tries to solve the problem of the center with the move pawn to e6. He is more focused on breaking down white's advantage rather than trying to play for the advantage that he has, the extra pawn on the c4 square. Very instructive. After e6, Gukesh played h3. We have captures, and captures. In this position, Ding played knight to d7. It should be noted that after knight takes on d5, you have the move knight takes on c4, and the problem is that the bishop and the queen guard the attack the knight on d5. Black does have the move bishop d4, but then white can invade on the dark squares with bishop h6, and the rook has to move or you win material. If the rook moves, then the knight falls. After takes, the knight on d5 falls. So you cannot take the pawn on d5. So after knight e7, Gukesh captured on c4, and material is level. White has a central advanced pawn, and he has the two bishops. And the pawn is nicely defended by the bishop on f3. So it appears white has a good advantage. Ding does have a queenside pawn majority, And if he's able to get these rolling, maybe it'll compensate for white's center. We have pawn b5, knight to a3 attacking the pawn, and queen b6. So now we need to be precise again as white, as black has very simple moves. They're going to go rook d8 or rook e8, and they're going to start pushing their pawns on the queen side. This is a tough decision for you with the white pieces. You want to develop the dark squared bishop, but if you do, then as soon as their knight moves, the b2 pawn falls. The knight on a3 stands poorly, and maybe you can go to c4 if black starts playing the move pawn b4. According to the engine, bishop f4 is best, and the move that I was thinking was queen to b3. In the game, let's see what Gukesh plays. He plays bishop to f4. Okay, finishing his development and not worrying too much about the pawn on b2 at the moment because the knight is blocking the bishop. We have rook to e8, and again we have to solve the problem of how to continue to make progress. Black is offering us a trade of rooks. Do we really want a trade of rooks here? How do we start mobilizing our pawns? Pushing the pawn to d6, although it activates the bishop, maybe it's a little bit too early, and after d6 the rook can simply move to safety. Gukesh continues developing with queen d2. We have rook to d8, and now knight to c2. Knight to f8, putting some pressure on the pawn, making sure that if bishop h6 is ever played, black can take, and then the d5 pawn falls. So here Gukesh played the move pawn b4, and the idea of this move is to clarify the pawn structure on the queen side. You have two options for black. White for sure will take the pawn if black does something besides taking or pushing the pawn. So black has two options, to take or to push the pawn. Well, if you take the pawn, then we can take with the knight, improving the quality of the knight and jumping in with potentially knight c6. If you take with the pawn, white probably could take with the queen, but knight takes should be sufficient. But if you push the pawn, then you lose control over the dark squares along this diagonal, which is exactly what happened in the game. And if you don't take, then of course white will take, and again you'll still have some problems along this diagonal. So Dink plays pawn c4, and after bishop to e3, which I think is a very strong move, putting pressure on the queen and the pawn on a7, after queen to a6, Gukesh finds a very nice improvement for the bishop, where it attacks the f6 and g7 bishop and also attacks on the a7 square as well. I really like this use of the bishop, maximizing its power. In addition to that, it also prevents any counterplay along this diagonal as well. So a very multi-purpose maneuver, bishop e3 and bishop d4. Dean captures, we have rook captures, and queen takes on a2. Is black's queen getting trapped? Surely not. He must have calculated that the queen is not going to be trapped. In the game, Gukesh played rook to a1, we have queen to b3, and rook to a3, and the queen's only square is on the b1 square. After king g2 and rook d7, holding onto the pawn on a7, the black queen, although it appears extremely active into white's position, it is very vulnerable. And if black's not careful and tries to take the pawn, for example, we have the move bishop to e4, and the queen has 0 squares to go to, and the queen will very likely be lost. After the move rook to a5, we have queen b3, rook to a3, queen b1, rook to a5, queen b3. Gukesh does not want to play for a draw, as we saw in the previous game, but in this game he has the two bishops, he has the advanced pawn. He is down one pawn at the moment, but he will be able to capture a7 or b5 at any moment, and he decides not to repeat. He captures the pawn on b5. After queen d3, we have a choice here if we want to trade queens or not. Gukesh decides to avoid the queen trade and play the move queen to f4. A slight inaccuracy according to the engine. The best move was bishop to e3, allowing black to take, but we take back with the bishop. After queen to f4, we have queen takes on c2, bishop takes on f6, and queen to f5. If you take on f6, then after queen takes on f6, the white queen, rook, and bishop are much better placed than the rook, which is passive, tied to blocking this pawn, and the knight, which is not doing too much. The queen, on the other hand, is very active, but its goal is to support the advance of the pawn, which white will easily be able to control with the move rook c5. So queen to f5 is a very nice defensive move by Ding. Although white can take and ruin the pawn structure, Ding is eliminating white's most powerful piece and source of tremendous counterplay against the black pieces and black king. So he offers a trade of queens, and Gukesh takes. We have captures, and bishop takes on g7, and king takes on g7. So we've reached the endgame position, and I like to pause when I reach the endgame in my own tournament games and ask, what are our plans? What are we looking to achieve here? Well, material is equal. We have a bishop versus a knight, so generally we want to be able to have pawns on both sides of the board to be able to attack and defend on both sides. That's good for white. In addition to that, we also see some weaknesses. The c4 pawn, a7 pawn, and f5 pawn are weak. So we have some targets. In terms of king safety, maybe both kings are safe here. They don't really have to worry too much about getting checkmated, which means both sides are trying to activate their kings. Maybe the best square for the king is going to be on f6, and maybe the white's best square for the king will be on f4 or f3 or some variation of activating the king. We have 3 pawns on the king side for both sides, so it'll be tough for white to break through on the king side, but white does have this pass pawn on the d file. So from that perspective, we should aim to start targeting black's weaknesses. Maybe once we win a weakness, we can get some trades and try to win the game. So Gukesh plays rook c5, attacking the pawn on c4. We have knight to g6, rook takes pawn, and knight to e5, forking the bishop and the rook. After rook d4, we have knight to c6. You cannot take the knight because of the pin along the d file. And after rook to f4, targeting the pawn on f5, we have knight to e7, defending the pawn. Really nice maneuver by Ding to get his knight back in the game while winning tempos against the rook and defending his weak points. White is up a pawn though and has a sizable advantage. After pawn to b5, we have king to f6 and rook to d4. Pawn to h6 and king to f1 and king to e5. King to e5 is an inaccurate move according to the engine. The best thing that Ding could have done is recognize that the knight's purpose on e7 has done its job. The f5 pawn is no longer needed to be supported, and the best move is rerouting the knight from c8 to this blockading square on d6, stopping white's pawn for a very long time from pushing. After king to e5, white has a large advantage and plays the move rook to h4, attacking the pawn. We have knight takes on d5, rook takes on h6. Okay, I want to mention that as a general rule in the endgame, when you have a winning advantage, you want to trade off the pieces, not the pawns. The reason you want to trade off the pieces is that if we have this exact same position, but we take away the knight, the bishop, the rook, and the rook, what we're left with is an endgame where it's just 2 kings against each other, and white has this extra pawn, which is going to allow him to get a queen. From black's perspective, it is the absolute opposite. When you are down in the endgame, you want to trade off the pawns, not the pieces. The reason for this is that if you trade off all the pawns, or at least let's say there's just 1 pawn left on the board, this f2 pawn, and you trade off all the pawns, but white still is up this 2 pawn, black at some point might be able to sacrifice one of his pieces to be able to get a drawn endgame. For example, a rook and bishop versus rook endgame against king and king, of course, is a theoretically drawn endgame. So instructive ideas to mention just to reinforce your understanding of the endgame here. So from white's perspective, piece trades are generally favorable. The problem is that there are certain piece trades that potentially lead to some draws. If you have 2 rooks left on the board, and you're simply up 1 pawn for white, it may not be enough to win the game, but it still gives you a lot of good chances to win. Ideally, you would love to have a scenario where white manages to trade the 2 rooks. This would ensure that white has a bishop versus knight scenario, and you have pawns on both sides of the board, which favors white. So some endgame ideas, and let's see if Gukesh is able to recognize these and play them out to perfection. After knight c3, we have the move rook c6, which I think is probably the best move of the game after rook c6. After knight to e4, and we have the move king to e1. And I was so surprised by the move king to e1. And the engine's best move, I'm not exactly sure in this position what it was, but the move king e1 was an inaccurate move, and I believe rook a6 was the best move in the position, just moving the rook to put pressure on the a7 pawn. Maybe h4 is also considered a best move because white is going ahead with continuing their plan of pushing the passed pawn. But I was actually considering the move based on this idea of trading pieces, not pawns, of just simply taking the knight. And you have a choice. You can take with the king or take with a pawn. After you take with the pawn, this trade surely favors white. I'm sure Gukesh looked at this, he analyzed this capture, and maybe this was the best chance for him to play other than the way he played in the game if you're not going to find rook a6 or pawn to h4. White is up a pawn, and white is only playing for a win, and Ding will have to play very precisely in order to get a draw here. So king to e1, an extremely surprising move here. We have pawn to f6. And at this point, I noticed there's a big difference between how Gukesh plays with a lot of time versus low time. When he gets down to low time, he starts to play very concretely, but misses some strategic objectives here. Again, you have the opportunity to take the knight. It's in a slightly different circumstance, but still this is possible. He plays pawn to h4, we have rook to d3, and bishop d1. I don't understand what this move aims for. The move king to e2 was perfectly playable, improving the king and defending the bishop. If you play the move rook d2, we can play simply king e3. So bishop d1, moving the bishop to safety, but I'm not exactly sure what he's aiming for with this move. We have pawn to f4. As a general rule, you want to trade pawns here with the black pieces, not pieces. Pawn takes, king takes, and bishop c2. Rook d5. Now the rook is in perfect position to target white's pawns and stop the h-pawn from promoting. Also, white's pawn structure has now just been crippled, making it tougher for these pawns to be defended. After rook c4, we have pawn to f5, rook to b4, king to f3, and it feels like black is the one who's actually pushing in this position. We have bishop d1 check, king g2, rook to b3, rook to e5, and pawn to f4. Rook to e7, rook to e3, rook to h7, and pawn to h5. So Gukesh trying to make some progress, but with the bishop on d1, how exactly are you going to help this pawn go up the board? Black has a knight on the e4 square protected by a very strong pawn on f5, and black king is very active as well, ready to go after the g3 square and then f4 pawn if the rook ever tries to get active himself. So I think at this point we have 42 seconds for Gukesh, 3 minutes 54 seconds for Ding. I think Ding is actually in the driver's seat at this point. After knight f6, rook to e5, knight wins a pawn, rook takes, knight to g3, rook to b7 attacking the pawn, bishop to a4, king to f3, f5, king f4, f6, knight to e4, knight to d6, king to e5, knight f7, and Ding picks up the f pawn, and the game should end in a draw, and it ends quite quickly and quite easily for Ding Liren. After king d2, we have rook b6, bishop c4, rook d6, king c3, takes, knight d6, and Ding just sacrifices the knight for the pawn. And this is why it's so important for black to recognize that we want to trade the pieces so that if the time comes, we can always sacrifice our remaining piece for that final pawn, or we can reach an endgame that's potentially theoretically drawn. So a very exciting game. Gukesh had an opportunity to get a huge advantage in a certain moment of the game, going for this move h4, rook a6, or even taking on e4 and getting an endgame up a pawn, maybe a little bit more drawish with the rook on the board. Game 7 is over. We are going to move with Ding Liren with the white pieces tomorrow, and we'll see what happens. I think the closer we get to the rapid time controls, Ding will have an advantage over Gukesh. So we'll see what happens in tomorrow's games. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you tomorrow.